Ambassador Vishnu Prakash, who of course has served as the ambassador to South Korea in the past, joins us on the broadcast, as does strategic affairs expert Stephen Golub, who is joining us from the United States. Good morning, gentlemen. Thank you both for making time to speak with us on this extremely historic day, one that's been called unprecedented. Ambassador Prakash, to you first. You've been, of course, watching this with a keen eye ever since President Trump has come to power and the barbs between him and Kim Jong-un started to fly. Your initial thoughts on the fact that the handshake has happened and that closed-door meeting is taking place even as we speak?
The very fact that the handshake has happened is a historic development. Just 6 months ago, nobody in his wildest dreams could have imagined that such a summit, such an encounter could take place. It is simply historic. It reminds me of another famous handshake of 1972 when President Nixon had flown down to Beijing and had the handshake with Chairman Mao. I think we are seeing history being made. I think that sun is shining on the Korean Peninsula because this time the Cassandras have been saying that, oh, we have seen there, we have done it, we have seen this before, nothing is likely to come. But this time it is very, very different. North Korea has now got a deterrent which it was seeking for years, for decades, and it is led by a young ruler who has shown amazing dexterity, amazing nimbleness and confidence. So I think what we are seeing is very rare moments in history when hostilities are transformed into peace, and I, for one, am quite hopeful.
All right. I think a number of people share that sentiment, including Professor Golub, the former U.S. President Bill Clinton. I was hearing him speak with a late-night host, Stephen Colbert, over the weekend, and he was, of course, promoting his new book. But when it came to talk of this meeting, he said all of the United States should support President Donald Trump, despite differences between Republicans and Democrats, that this meeting and the outcome that President Trump is hoping for needs to be supported. Are you one of those Americans?
Well, I certainly support the idea of leaders talking to each other rather than talking about going to war, which was the case not that long ago. So that is fundamentally good. However, a few notes of caution. One, these two leaders' goals remain very opposed to each other. The U.S. insists that North Korea completely give up nuclear weapons. North Korea, as far as we know, is not going to do so because it sees those, according to our own CIA's assessment of their goals, it sees nuclear weapons as essential to their survival. Two, we have a U.S. president and the North Korean regime, which have a history of lying and going back on agreements. So whatever comes out of this should be viewed really as with great caution. It may just be a photo opportunity type of event. There may be less there than meets the eye going forward. Third, in speaking of photo opportunities, that's fundamentally what this is for Donald Trump. He doesn't have an interest in foreign policy. He has an interest in his own political success and political survival. If this bolsters him going forward to the November congressional elections, which could determine his political fate, then whatever happens down the line, whether an agreement or a process falls apart, is less important to him than scoring political points today.
Okay, Ramesh Ramachandran, political points being scored by both, I suppose, the North Korean leader and President Donald Trump in seeing this meeting go through. But beyond that, I mean, do you think that this is simply just a matter of optics, or is this something a little bit more than just two men trying to bring or trying to associate history with their own personal brand?
Oh yes, optics, no doubt, Aisha, both symbolism and substance. Both leaders, Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, would be seeking to inject substance into the discussions. At the same time, they cannot tend to afford to ignore the symbolism of the entire event. This is a media spectacle, one which the entire world is watching as we speak. But that said, I was listening to Stephen Golub, and I was struck by the fact that this makes for prime time television viewing back home in the US. This is almost almost 9:30 a.m. in the morning here, which means 9:30 p.m. in the US on the East Coast. So this for me is all about optics. He wants to tell his domestic constituents back home that he can be a deal maker and that he can be expected to strike a good bargain, a grand bargain, if you will, with the Kim Jong-un going forward. If not today, then in the future.
Indeed. Ambassador Singh, I want to pick up on another thing that Professor Golub mentioned, and that is, of course, history and precedent. That hangs heavy on this meeting. The fact that, as you were mentioning, accords have been made in the past and they've been broken as well. And the fact that the US doesn't exactly have the best record when it comes to assuring people of the best possible outcome. I'm talking about Colonel Gaddafi. I'm talking about what happened with Iraq.
So a couple of things here. You may recall that in 1994, there was an agreement between the United States and North Korea on the nuclear issue, where North Korea had committed to full-scope safeguards and had committed to delay the effectuation of its withdrawal from the NPT, which it had given a notice in 1993. And after some years, that agreement collapsed, because the US felt that North Korea was not keeping up its end of the bargain, and North Korea felt that the kind of economic assistance and relief that US had promised was not forthcoming. So that didn't work out. And from the North Korean point of view, given the fact that the US president has walked back from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, from the nuclear agreement with Iran, has gone back on an agreement that he signed with the G7 countries.
Right.
He had agreed to the communique, then he walked back from that. So one can always ask the question that if there is an agreement with North Korea, how are you sure that he doesn't walk back from that, or that the next US president doesn't walk from that?
Sure.
So all this is going to complicate, certainly, the discussion. The history of their own agreement processes with the United States, and how the United States has observed agreement with other countries.
Right.
And then the other thing we discussed was about reassurance for the regime.
Right.
So what you referred to about Libya, for example, Libya had given up whatever effort it was making on the nuclear issue, but had been given some assurances regarding regime protection. And later it was UK, France, with the US, as it was described, leading from behind, which took the effort to take action against Colonel Gaddafi. So again, they would need some reassurance that whatever steps they take down the path of some kind of non-proliferation measures, what is the kind of reassurance they receive? And if you look at most of the analytical commentary coming out of the US today, they are saying that complete, irreversible, verifiable denuclearization is not possible at this stage.
Right.
Whatever may happen down the line, and the US should push for a limited objective, some limits on its ballistic missile capability, and some rollback on its nuclear program at this stage, and then see how the process evolves.
Right. And Ambassador Prakash, I mean, I think that is, as Ambassador Singh is pointing out, a key takeaway from all of the commentary so far has been that the goals that we're talking about, that both the United States and North Korea perhaps are looking at, are long-term goals. There's really nothing that can be ascertained in the here and now. Isn't that self-defeating in itself? Because, presidential terms don't last for very long. President Trump is already a year and a half through with his own. How exactly does Kim Jong-un ascertain or be sure of the fact that what he signs with President Trump today, if at all, is something that is going to be maintained in the years to come when there might be a change in dispensation in the United States?
Absolutely right. Kim Jong-un is very conscious of the transactional nature of the US diplomacy. North Koreans, despite the propaganda, negative propaganda in the Western world, are keen observers of international affairs. They have drawn the right lessons. And that is precisely why both sides in general and Kim Jong-un in particular is going with eyes wide open. He is not going to accept US grandstanding. He is not going to accept unreasonable US terms. And CVID is on the complete and verifiable irreversible nuclear disarmament is not going to happen, at least not in the next few years. And the best part is that despite taking out a public position of that is going to be a one-shot deal, it is either take it or leave it, US has very much come around to conceding and accepting that it's a process. It's a very important development from a one-shot deal to a process, as President Trump has said. Now the Americans understand that Kim is not going to succumb to threats. So there is a realism as both sides get into the summit. And also let us not forget that President Trump has invested so much into the summit. The stakes for him are far higher in some ways. He has successfully managed to antagonize the world, his allies, friends and foes. And then he flies down 36 hours in advance to Singapore because stakes are very high for him. And that is what leads me to believe that some kind of a successful outcome has already been choreographed, because Trump cannot afford to go back saying it was a failure. So, and the back channels have been at work, high-level discussions have been at work. They have had many rounds of discussions. So what the US is ready, in my view, to declare victory, and they will perhaps be able to say that they are launching a process, and they will take things forward. I'll close at with just one additional comment, and that is about the 1994 Framework Accord. The reason it collapsed was that there was bad faith on both sides. It is very clear now, and President Clinton has said it and alluded to the fact that the US believed that the North Korean regime will not last very long, and therefore they did not go full steam ahead. And the Cassandras have been saying for the last 70 years that the North Korean regime will collapse, but it has not happened. So I would argue that both sides are being realistic. They understand what is at stake, and that is what is the big difference between the previous occasions and this.
All right. Interesting points all, Ambassador. Ramesh, I believe you wanted to come in on one of the points that we brought up.
Yes, thank you. I couldn't agree more with Ambassadors Arun Singh and Vishnu Prakash, but I just wanted to add a quick point. There is no one country that we know about it yet which has voluntarily given up its nuclear weapons. So let's appreciate the fact that this is a huge demand the world is making of Kim Jong-un. Nobody has done it before. Will he want to do it? That still remains a moot point. Now, that said, some would say that Donald Trump is being unreasonable and maybe uncharitable to Kim Jong-un by insisting on applying maximum pressure, not relenting on sanctions, insisting on CVID. That may be a deal breaker in the run-up to the summit. What happens behind us in the hotel is another matter. But if the optics anything go by, then we are not anyway closer to an agreement on the issue of those crucial issues. Also, the fact is that will Donald Trump revisit the US-South Korea treaty alliance? That remains a moot point. Will America be willing to reduce troops? Trump administration has said no to that. Will America revisit its nuclear doctrine, nuclear position, nuclear assets in the East Asia? That remains a moot point. So all these issues will be discussed sometime going forward. Remember, South Korea remains under the American nuclear umbrella. So there's an asymmetry at play here, which North Korea believes might not hold it in good stead going forward. Therefore, it requires feels the need for having a nuclear deterrent. So these are issues which need time and effort and energy going forward. At the moment, as we speak, both leaders trying to set the agenda, at least a roadmap going forward, which with their respective diplomats can take up in the days and months ahead.
And I guess roadmap and blueprint are the words to describe what's happening today. Professor Golub, speaking about that asymmetry though, just going by the body language from yesterday in Singapore, President Trump choosing to stay huddled in at his hotel with his advisors, Kim Jong-un of course stepping out and soaking in the sights and sounds of Singapore. Would it be fair to say that the United States has more to lose here than North Korea? It's always craved legitimacy, and in some ways President Trump has provided the young North Korean leader that by even agreeing to meet with him.
Well, I think it's correct to say that. I think it's also correct to say that, in a sense, the United States has already lost a lot here in terms of Kim establishing himself as a friendly face, even though he's the leader of the most repressive, human rights abusing nation in the world. Some initial relaxation of sanctions against him, better relations with South Korea, the U.S. in effect recognizing North Korea as a nuclear power. And the U.S. hasn't gotten much in return One thing I'd like to add to this whole discussion is the reality that Donald Trump can be manipulated and heavily influenced by people both within and outside his own administration. Given his ignorance and real lack of interest in foreign relations, given his short attention span, it's possible that whatever comes out of this, however it may look, however good it may look, an end to the nuclear war, an end to the Korean War, which in a formal sense is still going on. For example, a declaration along those lines. Donald Trump's chief foreign policy advisor, John Bolton, his national security advisor, is a real hardline hawk, very right-wing. He has other people like that in his administration. So it's very possible that 6 months, a year, 18 months down the line, they'll prevail on him either in subtle or direct ways to challenge Kim to become bellicose again, either because the U.S. or North Korea or both are not proceeding along the lines sketched here today, possibly sketched here today. So don't discount the possibility, or the reality, I should say, that Donald Trump has people whispering in his ear, starting with his national security advisor, who don't really want to see peace with North Korea.
That's really interesting. Let's even see if they're around for the next 6 or 8 months. I mean, given what's happened at the White House since President Trump has taken charge, you never know. We might have a different national security advisor altogether 6 months down the line, Ambassador Singh. But the alignment over here of the different players, I mean, John Bolton and Mike Pompeo both considered hawkish on North Korea. But Mike Pompeo, one of the first people from the U.S. administration to meet with Kim Jong-un. The fact that there are these people involved, and I'm talking not just about the Americans, but also Moon Jae-in, Kim Jong-un himself and Donald Trump, it seems like there is a larger, let's say, alignment at play that has brought all of these forces together at this opportune time for this meeting to take place.
So I think there are two sets of players here. One set of players within the U.S. administration and another set of players in terms of other countries whose interests and stakes are involved. Clearly, South Korea would want this process to continue with step-by-step measure of success. They have been pushing for it. President Moon Jae-in has been heavily invested in this process. He's met the North Korean leader twice. He is the one and his administration that has persuaded U.S. to go down this path. Because if there is any kind of hostility or any kind of outbreak of conflict, they will suffer the maximum consequences. And so they would want the process of normalization to move forward. Similarly, China, they would want a reduction in the hostility between U.S. and North Korea, so that the kind of restriction they've had to place on North Korea, they can ease up on that. Japan would be watching it very closely, because while reduction in hostility would certainly be welcome, they would not like that to be achieved at their expense, because they would worry that U.S. may want to enter into an arrangement limiting North Korea's missile capabilities, but that doesn't quite protect Japan in terms of access. So how does that play out? And there is issue of people from Japan who had been abducted by the North Korean regime and then taken to North Korea. So that's an emotional issue in Japan. So there are a lot of interests involved among the regional countries. And another country which doesn't get the same level of attention is Russia.
Yes, I was going to
Because Russia has a
too.
strong relationship with North Korea.
It does.
And at the time when the issue had started in terms of the Korean War, before the Chinese troops had come in, Russia had played some role. Now, in terms of the configuration within the administration, as you pointed out, over time, the more hardline people, Bolton, Pompeo, have come in. But many have argued that in many ways, President Trump is now his own man. And since January this year, the Trump administration has been described by many as Trump 2.0. Because in the first year of his administration, he was new, he was still listening to advisors. There were advisors who were reflecting the more conservative Republican point of view. He has now gained confidence. He feels he should set the agenda. He should decide what is being done. And that although Bolton and Pompeo are hardliners and would be, of course, advising him, they are in many ways carrying out what his political agenda requires.
Right.
So he is the one who is determining what he wants done, and they are implementing that. And of course, they would be advising him in that process. So I think this struggle will go on.
It will continue
between the hardline advisors and his own political instincts.
Okay, I can't wait to find out what President Trump 3.0 is going to be all about. 1 and 2 have been exciting enough. Professor Golub, I believe you have a comment to make.
Well, I would just add, look what we're coming to if, in fact, we're relying on Donald Trump's own political instincts and foreign policy instincts as a possible salvation for his foreign policy. The man isn't interested. He's not really concerned about foreign policy strategy or outcomes. So I know I'm sounding like the voice of skepticism here today, but I'd add that additional note of caution that if the choice is between listening to very, very right-wing hardline advisors or following his own counsel, that's a really, really tough and daunting and discouraging choice that we have here in terms of what may be going on in his administration.
Allow me to come in on that point. We've got live visuals once again of President Trump and Kim Jong-un making their way down one of the hallways of the Capella Hotel. The one-on-one meeting, I believe, is over. They are now, of course, going to head across with their translators. There is a working lunch that's also planned for later in the day. Remember, President Trump is going to stay on in Singapore for a bit, but Kim Jong-un is expected to fly back to North Korea today itself. So the meeting, the one-on-one meeting is over, and of course, a battery of media personnel making their way down one of those hallways as well, hopeful of catching a glimpse perhaps once more of President Trump. We'll play those visuals out for our viewers once again of both those men making their way onto one of the balconies to wave out to the people gathered. But before I go there, I just want to bring in Ambassador Prakash as well. He's been waiting patiently. Ambassador, I wanted to ask you about specifically about Russia in all of this. Ambassador Singh alluded to Russia. The fact that Sergei Lavrov made his way across to North Korea a short while back. Well, it would be incorrect to say a short while back, but a couple of days ago, very strategically before this June 12th summit. What do you make of the Russia angle to all of this?
Russia and North Korea had a strong relationship at one point in time. Certainly the initial missile technology and even nuclear technology to North Korea was received by from USSR, and they have also been providing assistance, etc. So that is a fact. However, the fact remains that for the last decade plus, the relationship between Russia and North Korea has cooled down. Foreign Minister Lavrov's visit to Pyongyang and his meeting with Kim Jong-un on the 31st of May happened after more than 10 years. And now Russia is, in fact, what is happening is that Russia, China and Japan are all playing the catch-up game. They have been all caught unawares by the pace of events. They have, in fact, in some ways you can say that they have been blindsided because they never thought that such events could happen. And the last few months, weeks, there are only 3 countries which are calling the shots, led by North Korea. The narrative has been gripped, has been wrested by North Korea. Kim Jong-un is in the driver's seat. And South Korea and USA are the other 2 major players. China, for once, is only is watching from the sidelines. Japan is a bystander, and Russia wants to prospectively be dealt back into the game. So that is the kind of scenario. But all credit to President Moon Jae-in.
Right.
And coming to the so-called hawks in the U.S. administration, I would like to say that there are either one of the 2 scenarios are playing out.
Right.
Either
Sir, allow me to come in. I apologize for cutting you off over there. I just want to bring our viewers up to date on what's happening. The 2 delegations are meeting now. General John Kelly there at the far end of the table. President Trump, of course, and Mike Pompeo representing the United States. The translators, of course, speaking on behalf of both sides. Let's turn up the volume on that conversation. Let's see if we can catch a few snatches of what's going on.
We successfully shipped out the package that way down the middle of our problem. and we overcame all kinds of skepticism and speculations about this historic summit, and I believe that this is a big relief to peace.
저번에 말씀드린 것 같지만 이때까지 다른 사람들이 해보지 못한 그런 물론 그 과정은 도전도 있었지만 그냥 그와 함께 훌륭한 출발을 끌은 언어를 기여하고 앞으로 당신한테 거대한 그런 사업을 시작해볼 수 있을 수 있습니다.
Well, as I said earlier, I'm prepared to involve all those cooperation with you as a person. Of course, there will be challenges ahead, but I'm willing to do this. I'm willing to do this great work. We will solve it. We will be successful. And I look forward to working on it with you. It will be done.
우리는 함께 할 것이고 그 문제를 해결할 것입니다. 그리고 함께 해결하는 것을 기대할게요.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Thank you.
Right, so louder than the voices, perhaps the sound of those camera shutters going off. President Trump and Kim Jong-un have concluded their one-on-one meeting. The delegations are now meeting. Let me go across to Ramesh Ramachandran, who's joining us live from Sentosa Island. Ramesh, give us an update on what is going to take place now. Bring us up to speed on development, so to speak, in terms of the agenda going forward from this point on, now that the one-on-one is over.
Indeed, so we saw the two leaders shake hands at 9 a.m. local time sharp, and then followed by a one-on-one meeting where they came face-to-face for the first time ever in each other's country's history, followed by the delegation-level talks happening now as we speak. This will be followed by a working lunch, and that will bring curtains down on the first summit meeting between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. We are given to understand there will be a joint press statement or possibly an American press briefing from the American side for the visiting media here, but no word yet on whether a joint statement will be issued or a joint press statement will be issued. The fact is that American media is more likely to make a statement, not the North Korean side. Remember, Kim Jong-un is expected to leave Singapore by about 2 p.m. local time, and Donald Trump is set to leave around 8 p.m. local time. So everything has to be done, wrapped up in the next couple of hours actually, before the two leaders disperse and leave the Capella Hotel here. But just to make a quick point here that about the echo chamber that Professor Stephen Golub was trying to make. Now, we've seen in the past that one wrong step, a misstep from either side could sound the death knell for a reset. We know about Hillary Clinton, who famously stood with Sergei Lavrov of Russia in the year 2011-12 with a red button, the reset button, and we know what happened afterwards. We saw what happened to the Obama administration with the so-called Arab Spring. So we'll have to wait and watch, take one step at a time as to what eventually will pan out between these two countries whose leaders are meeting here. So we'll have to reserve our judgment till after a reasonable period of time to let it all sink in.
Right. Ambassador Singh, do you think also going by what has happened in the past, the different examples you alluded to and the one that Ramesh brought up, that it's also everyone is looking at this summit with a pinch of salt, or a little bit more than that perhaps, maybe a handful of it, because they know that, the outcomes are, like you said, long awaited. They're not something that's going to happen right away.
So today I think the image will be of a successful summit. They've met, everybody is invested in this process, and if you saw even in his public comment, President Trump said that we will be tremendously successful. So he has already indicated how he wants to project it, and he needs it for his own political purposes. The one-on-one meeting lasted 45 minutes, as had been projected earlier, that would be the duration. There was a lot of concern in the US analytical community about that one-on meeting, because there are no note-takers, only the interpreters, and therefore what kind of understanding is reached there?
Right.
And what is the kind of record and appreciation of that understanding? So I think from that point of view, this meeting now that's happening with the delegation, where there are really only 3 officials on the US side, the Chief of Staff, the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor, will be critical in terms of trying to understand what the two leaders discussed,
right,
what is their understanding of what has come out of that meeting, and concretize something for the way forward. And then, of course, they're going to have a working lunch with an expanded format with some more advisors joining. So I think today it will be a successful summit, but how it will play out would depend on the understanding each side takes away and depend on how they try and negotiate their way through the implementation of that, maximizing their own advantage.
Right.
So it will be a complex process going forward.
Right. And Professor Golub, just to press that point of this being a well-choreographed event, as Ambassador Prakash called it, but I do wonder, you know, the three people who are representing the United States, at least the two that I got to look at, aren't exactly diplomats. I mean, you've got a military veteran there in General John Kelly, and you've got the former FBI director in Mike Pompeo, the former CIA director Mike Pompeo. So that has been a concern that has been raised by a number of analysts in the United States, that President Trump isn't surrounded by people with the requisite experience, not just in foreign policy, but also in dealing with North Korea. And the fact that there's been concern also about the fact that North Koreans aren't, the most trustworthy of negotiators when it comes down to the brass tacks of it. Your comments on that analysis that's been coming out of the U.S.?
Well, certainly it's true when it comes to North Koreans, but as I mentioned earlier, it also applies to Donald Trump. And I'm sorry, I forgot which ambassador made this point, but you look back at the fact that Donald Trump just walked away from an agreement he made with our closest allies, and Canada has walked away from an agreement our country made with Iran on nuclear matters itself. So, and then I'll circle back to the point that Ramesh made, that this is just the beginning. This is a snapshot or a photo opportunity, as I noted. We'll see how this process unfolds going forth. But given the fact that the fundamental negotiating positions and interests of the two sides are so diametrically opposed about whether or not North Korea will give up all of its nuclear weapons, there are reasons to be very concerned about this going forward. I think one other point I'd add is that yet another way in which Mr. Kim has had some success throughout this whole process so far is that he has planted the seeds for dividing the U.S. allies in terms of Japan being very concerned about what comes out of this, how the U.S. may be agreeing to. So there are, again, lots of sources for concern going forward, including the fact that the very diametrically opposed positions by two sides who really aren't very trustworthy.
Okay. And you're saying it's not just the people representing President Trump, but President Trump himself, who may not have, let's say, the dexterity to handle something of such import. I'll request all of you, Ramesh Ramachandran, both our ambassadors, and Professor Golub, to stay on with us.